Well, it's a first in Quebec. We'd seen it across the rest of the country for quite some time. A judge taking into account race when it came down to sentencing. Last week, the black man who pleaded guilty to selling cannabis and hash, sentenced to 24 months in prison after the presiding judge took into consideration the systemic barriers against people of color. The judge in the case, Magali Lepage, in her decision, saying, "We must learn. We must adapt," taking a year off that sentence there. The minister responsible here in Quebec for the fight against racism is Christopher Skeete. He called that a sad first. Minister Skeete, Christopher, welcome back to the program.
Good morning, Elias.
Triste, sad is what you called it online. Explain that. Why do you call it a sad first?
Well, since time immemorial, the objective for all persons, black persons, has always been equality under the law. Equal opportunity, equal access, equal justice, but also equal responsibility under the law. Here, what we have is the formalization of difference, the formalization of discrimination. And I think that takes us further from our goal. If the goal is to stop racism, if the goal is to have more equality in our society, how can the path to more equality be adding more inequality?
What do you think? There are so many people. I mean, this came down through the Canadian criminal justice system and decisions made on the federal side of things by the Liberal government. There are so many people that believe, no, this is the pathway to fairness and equality. What do you think they're getting wrong?
I think that what they're getting wrong is that this obsession that we have collectively, and it's part of the multiculturalist theory, is to say this celebration of difference, which is in and of itself a good thing, but this hyper emphasis on what makes us different creates this scenario where, well, if you're different, then it must be okay for you. It's a form of cultural relativism. And of course, that can't be the way we do things. If we are all different and we all have our own particularity, well, then there's always a good reason for us to do anything. The law and justice under the law in the tradition of Western philosophy has always been this insistence that we must all be unequivocally equal. Now, are there gaps for indigenous populations? Are there gaps for Afro-Canadians? Absolutely. But that's a training issue. Judges need to be sensitized to that reality, and within their sentencing guidelines, they must apply what they know into those sentencing guidelines. But judges already have that ability. What's new here, and what's a sad first for me, is we're formalizing it by saying, well, we're going to measure you differently because you're black, and you will get a reduced sentence because you're black. How is that better than getting a harsher sentence because you are black? And that's what used to happen in the past. So I don't think we can correct historical wrongs by creating new injustices.
Do you think what about the outcomes of this? Like, there's some people that say, well, this will lead to better outcomes and a safer society. What do you say to that?
Well, I would say if the objective, so basically the people who think that base themselves on the troubling statistics that there are more indigenous people and more people of color in our prisons. So they're saying, well, it must be because it's racist. Well, okay, let's assume that that's correct. Well, is there discrimination in the way that judges are applying sentencing? If that's the case, then it's a training issue, not a legal issue. But what you're doing is your remedy for what is essentially a training issue becomes a legal change, thereby saying that from henceforth, these people will always get reduced sentences. How can that be right? And what's the correction? Let's say we do end up with less people in prison. Okay, then that means black people for perpetuity will have reduced sentences. And what about white people? Are they going to get? Are they also going to get harsher sentences? And how is that different from going back in time? I think, Elias, what we've done is we're so motivated to try to correct our past, which has not always been great, that we're sort of overcomplicating things. The reality is there is discrimination in our society. Some people in the past have had bad outcomes, but now because some people in the past had bad outcomes, today's victims get less justice because we're trying to correct that. I don't think that that's the solution. The solution, Elias, is more equality. It's making sure that we are all given the same opportunities, but also the same responsibilities under the law.
We're with Quebec's minister responsible for the fight against racism, Christopher Skeete. We're discussing this recent court ruling in the province when it came to sentencing, where a judge gave a lighter sentence because of the race of the person convicted of selling cannabis and hash. Okay, so Christopher, I want to ask you about systemic racism, okay? Because obviously that was a previous controversy of your CIQ government, is that, you know, the government saying in Quebec you're not acknowledging systemic racism. So many people have pushed back against that. You are a person of color. We've had discussions about things that you have faced. How much does are you looking at systemic racism? How much does it guide your thoughts on this matter?
Well, I think this notion, this idea, this theory of systemic racism is sort of what gets us to outcomes like what this judge is doing. Because if we're inherently saying the system is flawed and broken, and there's like, you know, a system that can't be remedied, therefore we have to build in these crutches to sort of create outcomes that we want that are different. Well, then I would say that's the problem that people are not realizing that they're creating. So what you're doing is you're trying to cure racism, and in so doing, you're creating more racism. And I think that's the issue that we're sort of faced with in the West, is to say, well, how do we get better outcomes for our justice system for people of color who historically have gotten a bad deal? And how do we make sure it doesn't happen anymore? But unfortunately, the people who think that they're doing well ultimately create more discrimination. In other words, how is this different? And the question that I ask is, let's assume you accept this idea of systemic racism. Okay, is it just us? Is it just Quebec? Is it just Canada? Is it the U.S.? Is ours different from theirs? Is it the West in general? Is it the whole world? Is there systemic racism everywhere? How do you know when you've created or when you've cured it or you've gotten rid of it? How do you fight the system without tearing it down? Or is the idea to tear it down? Like, I think that kind of discussion is really not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is to make sure that every citizen, no matter what color they are, has equal opportunity, equal access under the law. And I think we sort of convoluted in all these abstract theories, but the idea is to say we all deserve equality. But now some are going to be more equal than others. And there was a book called 1984 by George Orwell who had that theory where some people were more equal than others, and that is not equality.
Let me ask, you reference Canadian multiculturalism off the top of this interview, and I do sense a growing schism between Quebec and the rest of Canada. Yeah, here we are, a Quebec judge bringing in something into the Quebec criminal justice system. Do you sense this growing gap, or is this an example of how, well, actually, the gap is getting smaller because that Canadian multiculturalist idea has shown up in our courts?
Well, actually, I would say that this is the outcome of a multiculturalist ideology that Canada has, that you're right, Quebec has never adopted. We haven't adopted it because we believe in Quebec in universalism. Universalism says we are all equal under the law, and your difference strengthens us, but it doesn't mean that we all have to live differently because you're different. And I think ultimately we have to get this right because we are a growing population. We have a lot of people who are coming here from other countries. And how do we build social cohesion if everybody is reinforced in their difference and no emphasis is made on what makes us the same, what brings us together? How do you build a country? How do you build a nation when we don't have a common bond? And I think that kind of question becomes more important than ever when we see the direction that the world is taking, Elias. We're going to be spending billions of dollars on our collective defense. Well, if everybody's from everywhere and no one has a sense of belonging to this community, well, what are we defending, really? Because what is it to be Canadian if everybody's from everywhere and there's no sense of identity to where we're from?
On this case, is your government going to do anything? Is there going to be like an appeal? Are you going to try and make sure this doesn't happen again? Anything? Because obviously there's judicial independence, but will you be doing anything here?
So you're right that there is judicial independence and there is separation of powers, and that's a good thing, okay? I speak for the people. I'm an elected official. And as an elected official, I'm saying that the judgment that it's their prerogative to come up with this judgment. It's my prerogative to say, do we really want to have this kind of world where people are treated differently based on the color of their skin? It wasn't good when we did it in white people's favor 150 years ago. How can it be good in black people's favor today? And I think we need to have that discussion. We need to have that debate. And we need to decide as a society, do we want judges creating our social order, or do we want to leave that to our elected officials? And I think that's an issue that we see also rising in other jurisdictions. I think the West in general is having increasingly that kind of discussion of, do we allow judges and laws and forces of the Constitution to stymie what people objectively want from their elected officials? A lot of times, as an elected official, my hands are tied to deliver the change that people want because I'm limited by jurisprudence and what judges have statutes on. So I think we are ripe for that discussion in the West in general and in Quebec also. But I totally respect that judges have the latitude and have the ability to say that. My hope is that as a society, we can have a discussion about whether or not we really want to live in that kind of world.
You've been generous with your time this morning. Minister Skeete, Christopher, thank you so much for coming on.
I appreciate your time, Elias.
That's Christopher Skeete, Quebec's minister responsible for the fight against racism.